Okay, hello guys.
Oh.
All right, so we're going to continue to read from Negative Dialectics tonight, and then on Thursday, so the next class in our final class session, we will be looking at the essays from the last basically year of Adorno's life, and those are Late Capitalism or Industrial Society, On Subject and Object, Marginalia to Theory and Praxis, and Resignation. And those are all included in the second folder in the files folder for Adorno. So it's in the file folder for class session 18, Adorno 2. So those will be more readily easy to find in the Canvas files. All right, let me see if any of you. Okay, so we did get one set of notes from last night. Okay, I guess that came in during our class. That's Jacqueline. So we might return to that because we have to catch up a bit still on the Negative Dialectics readings from last night, since we spent so much time on the preliminary readings, on the writings from the 1940s, as well as the Why Still Philosophy piece. Okay, so let me turn to, those are the only notes that people have posted so far. I think only Jacqueline has posted notes on Negative Dialectics. But let me get to that section. In the book. Right, that's the dialectics of identity, which we did do last night. We did the dialectics of identity. But maybe, here, I'll share my screen. Jacqueline, if you're here, if you wanted to talk about the notes that you posted for yesterday. Let me see if Jacqueline's here. Possibly not. All right, well, let's look at these notes. So, a critique of constitutive consciousness itself. This is from page 148 in Negative Dialectics. So it's in this section on the dialectics of identity that we read through yesterday. Right, the critique of ideology. The ideological side of thinking shows in its permanent failure to make good on the claim that the non-I is finally the I. The more the I thinks, the more perfectly will it find itself debased into an object. Identity becomes the authority for a doctrine of adjustment in which the object, which the subject is supposed to go by, repays the subject for what the subject has done to it. All right, so let's talk about this. Let's unpack this a bit. If we recall from Lukács from last week, there is the idea of the identical subject-object of history. So this was with respect to the proletariat. So the proletariat as the identical subject-object of history in capitalism, and what that meant was self-identical subject-object of history. What does self-identity mean? Self-identity is both achieved through and tasking of a self-overcoming. So when something attains to its concept or achieves self-identity, then it is ready to overcome itself. It's already realizing itself, but then it faces the task of negating or overcoming itself. So in this instance, he's talking about the division, this is something that we'll talk about on Thursday, between the subject and the object. The self, the individual self, the I, and he's really using the language of psychoanalysis here, of Freud, the ego, is both the subject and the object. So the ego or the I is an object for itself. Right, so this would be the self-identical subject-object. Pardon me, the subject that can take itself as an object, recognize itself, become a subject by recognizing itself as its own object. This is the kind of philosophical language that we're dealing with here. So what he's talking about here, however, in capitalism, is the division, the internal division of the individual self, or of the ego, or of the I, between its subject and object character, between its character as a subject and its character as an object. And not only for itself, but also for others. So one of the things that he talks about here about autonomy, the self-legislating, the self-ruling, the autonomous, that's what autonomy means, self-ruling, subject, or the autonomous individual, has nonetheless in capitalism become divided between itself as a subject and itself as an object. Okay, so what does that mean? Rather than the dialectical interplay of subject and object, the split between the subject and the object, it means that one's own attitude towards oneself is reified. So if we recall that the social relations are the social relations not only between people, namely relation to others, but also a relation to nature, to everything that exists, including everything that has come into existence as part of the historical process. So culture, society, history. And relation to self. So it's a self-relation as well. So what's the issue with reified social relations, the reified bourgeois social relations in capitalism, is that means that the self-relation is reified as well. So he says, the I becomes or is debased into an object. And in so doing, we could say that's reified subjectivity. That's the internal object, we might say. The external object also repays what the subject has done to it. Or the externalized object, that could also be the self. Right, insofar as one takes oneself as an object, treats oneself as an object, right, self-objectification, but not in that kind of deleterious way that we would normally connotate the use of that word, like objectification has a kind of negative, has a pejorative character, but just in a more neutral sense, taking oneself as an object. Right. So subject and object are both debased. It can appear to be what he calls the primacy of the subject, to which his response is the primacy of the object. So as a corrective to a primacy of the subject, he offers the primacy of the object. But this is just in the context of this division between the subject and the object. So certainly he doesn't want to do, and this is why it's in the dialectics of identity, he doesn't want to do a romantic, capital R romantic. What Robert Pippin called the romantic recoil from modernity. He doesn't want to do what he calls a back to nature. Right, so it says, we too finally need to free ourselves from universal coercion, just as freedom can come to be real only through coercive civilization and not by way of any back to nature. So when he says object, he also means everything that's objectified. He also means what has been objectivated, to use that language again that we first encountered, I think, in the Lukács, in the phenomenon of reification. Everything that has been objectivated, meaning everything that has been rendered objective. If we look at the reification chart of terms that we've used previously, just keep in mind how this works. Right, so we're talking about not just the subject and object, certainly not the subject and object as things, but that the subject only becomes a subject through a process of objectification, which is also a process of subjectification. A process of objectivation, meaning rendering the world objective, is also a process of subjectivation, namely rendering the world subjective. Really, it's an externalization of the subject into the world, into its objects, which is also at the same time an internalization of the object, or an internalization of the world as an object. Right, so that's really supposed to be the productive, positive dialectical interplay that in capitalism breaks down, it disintegrates and reverts into reification. Namely, the subject is a thing to itself. Reified consciousness, thing-like subjectivity. And the object is an object of contemplation, where the intrinsic practical relation, the interaction with the object, is lost, and instead the object becomes merely an object of contemplation. And he calls that phantom-like objectivity. Why phantom-like objectivity? Because we can recognize that the thing has been objectified, but we don't feel like we're any part of that. We feel alienated from that process of objectification. That happens socially and historically, but we feel ourselves to not be part of that process, but are rather alienated or estranged from it. Right? We don't recognize ourselves in the object, and that's why the object has a phantom-like objectivity, why it has a reified character. Right, so that identity of subject and object, the identity, he puts it, of the concept and its object, has now become a contradiction between concept and object. And therefore, between identity and non-identity. So the identity would be the identity of the concept and its object. The non-identity is when that sense of identity between concept and object is lost, or that sense of the object attaining to its concept, and of the concept attaining to or being adequate to, that's the other language he uses here, being adequate to its object, is lost. So again, when we're thinking about it in terms of the dialectic of being and becoming, one way of thinking about this is nature and spirit, or the extant and the actual. We have to keep these terms in mind. The given and the same versus the new and the different. What is versus what ought to be. The merely extant as opposed to its potential and possibility in its actuality. So I think that we skipped over this last night, but let's look at this now. In idealism, the highly formal identity principle had, due to its formalization, an affirmative substance. This is innocently brought to light by terminology, when simple predicative sentences are called affirmative. The copula says, it is so, not otherwise. So the copula is the is. So this is that. That's the copula. The act of a synthesis, for which the copula stands, indicates that it shall not be otherwise. Else the act would not be performed, like the act of stating what is. The will to identity works in each synthesis. As an a priori task of thought, a task immanent in thought, identity seems positive and desirable. The substrate of the synthesis is thus held to be reconciled with the I, and therefore to be good, which promptly permits the moral desideratum that the subject, understanding how much the cause is its own, should bow to what is heterogeneous to it. Identity is the primal form of ideology. We relish it as adequacy to the thing it suppresses. Adequacy has always been subjection to dominant purposes, and in that sense, its own contradiction. Right, we talked about this last night. Ideology's power of resistance to enlightenment is owed to its complicity with identifying thought, or indeed with thought at large. Meaning, if you recall from Robert Pippin from the first week of class, how to think what isn't without thinking nothing. Right, so can we only think about what is, or can we think about what isn't without saying nothing? Namely, what isn't is what could and should be, but is not. What could and should be, but is not yet. What could and should be, but what we have not achieved, and which tasks us. So simply saying this is the case seems to suppress and deny that, according to Adorno, according to what he's saying here. So this is really the point about ideology in that section. To go to Jacqueline's second point here, the dictates of its autarky condemn our thinking to emptiness. In the end, subjectively, the emptiness becomes stupidity and primitivity. Regression of consciousness is a product of its lack of self-reflection. We can see through the identity principle, but we cannot think without identifying. Any definition is identification. Okay, so I think that's in the same section. No, that's in the cogitative self-reflection. That's in the next section. So let's look at this. Cogitative self-reflection, or self-reflection in thinking. Adorno says, the force of consciousness extends to the delusion of consciousness. It is rationally knowable, where an unleashed, self-escaping rationality goes wrong, where it becomes true mythology. I'm actually going to bring in the other translation that we have. Let me do that. We have the translation from Dennis Redmond, which is a little bit less literary, but also more, can be, not always, but can be more accurate. Oops, not this one. Okay, this is good. All right, let me... Let's look at his table of contents. I'm just going to look at his... self-reflection of thought. Let's see if this is the same section. Yeah, so this is actually, we'll see a kind of a significantly different. The power of consciousness reaches all the way into its own deception. It is rationally cognizable, where a detached rationality has run away from itself, becomes false, turns truly into mythology. This is a little bit more accurate. The ratio, or reason, recoils into irrationality as soon as mistakes, in its necessary course, the fact that the disappearance of its substrate, be it ever so diluted, is the handiwork of its abstraction. Okay, this is a little bit clunky. Let's see what the other translation says. The ratio recoils into irrationality as soon as, in its necessary course, it fails to grasp the disappearance of its substrate, however diluted in its own work, the product of its own abstraction. That's a little bit better. And here's the passage that Jacqueline quoted. When thinking follows its law of motion unconsciously, it turns against its own sense, against what it has been thought, against that which calls a halt to the flight of subjective intentions. The dictates of its autarky condemn our thinking to emptiness. In the end, subjectively, the emptiness becomes stupidity and primitivity. Regression of consciousness is a product of its lack of self-reflection. We can see through the identity principle, but we cannot think without identifying. Any definition is identification. Let's see what the other translation does with that same passage. He writes, the dictate of autarky damns thinking to nullity. This becomes in the end subjectively stupidity and primitivity. And the regression of consciousness is the product of its lack of self-reflection. Okay, so very similar. Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's address this. So autarky is a slightly different spin on autonomy. So autarky kind of means the same thing as autonomy, self-rule, but it has a different implied meaning, different connotation, which is not just self-rule, but separation, isolation. Right, so in its isolation, our thinking is condemned to emptiness. So part of what he's doing with the primacy of the object, this is one of his catchphrases, he also calls it the predominance and or preponderance of the object. So the primacy of the object, the preponderance of the object, meaning the object becomes thought. It comes before thought, I should say, because the object precedes thought. It's preponderant. Or we could also say it's translated as predominance of the object. The attempt here is to break out of, to counteract this isolation. And to produce an outside, to project, to objectify, to externalize, which then allows for self-reflection. Right? So the very separation and confrontation, the division, the split, the contradiction between subject and object, at least that can be some kind of starting point for reflection. Right, so just as he had spent all this time pointing out that identity seems the goal of all conceptualization, he says the opposite now. But definition also approaches that which the object itself is as non-identical. In placing its mark on the object, definition seeks to be marked by the object. And then he says non-identity is the secret telos, or the secret goal or intention or purpose of identification. So in trying to make identical, what is suggested is non-identity. It is the part, he says, that can be salvaged. The mistake in traditional thinking is that identity is taken for the goal. The force that shatters the appearance of identity is the force of thinking. The use of "it is" undermines the form of that appearance, which remains inalienable just the same. Dialectically, cognition of non-identity lies also in the fact that this very cognition identifies, that it identifies to a greater extent and in other ways than identitarian thinking itself. This cognition seeks to say what something is, while identitarian thinking says what something comes under, what it exemplifies or represents, and what accordingly it is not itself. So the particular thing just serves as an example of an object, which is an example of a concept, a conceptual object. Right, so it seems to just imply identity. The more relentlessly our identitarian thinking besets its object, the farther will it take us from the identity of the object. Under its critique, identity does not vanish, but undergoes a qualitative change. Elements of affinity of the object itself to the thought of it come to live in identity. So what he's trying to explicate here is that just trying to grasp an object in thought, and that's what concept means. Concept means that with which we grasp something. The German word for this is Begriff, which sounds much more like, at a visceral level, more palpable level. That with which we grasp something, mentally grasp something, that with which we apprehend something, mentally, is, in our grasping of it, still separate from the concept. So if we're using the concept to grasp something, there still is something that the object is grasping. Right? Therefore, it suggests not only the domination of the concept over the object, but also the preponderance of the object and the primacy of the object, since that is what the concept is trying to grasp. Right, so he's trying to distinguish between two uses of concepts. One use of concept is just sort of casting a label, slapping a label on something. And he calls that suppressing of the object. The other way of using concepts is to articulate and express, to represent what something is, right, to get at its essential nature. And that would be the use of the concept that emphasizes non-identity, ironically enough. So there's kind of a double movement of contradiction here. Right? It would seem like if you're just slapping a label on things, you're actually preserving the thing separately from the concept. But no, he says it sort of suggests not that preservation of the non-identity of the object, but just its, what he calls its suppression, or its occlusion. Right? It's sort of hidden under the concept. Conversely, when we try to articulate what something essentially is, that would seem to be a collapsing of the difference between concept and object, and yet it's just in that attempt to do so that the non-identity of the object with its concept is expressed, is revealed, meaning in the striving or the tasking of the concept to grasp its object is expressed the non-identity of the object. So why is he going through this at such a kind of very fine-grained and paradoxical logical level? Right. Because he wants to get at the self-contradiction in what philosophy is trying to do. So if we recall that the whole purpose of this is the immanent dialectical critique of philosophy, then he has to get at how the very procedures of philosophy, what philosophy essentially does as an activity, has a self-contradictory character, and to bring out the character, how it appears, and hopefully the nature of that contradiction. All right, so just what are we trying to do when we philosophize at all? What are we trying to do? Also in the looser sense of philosophy, and that's why he says thinking, what are we trying to do when we're conceptualizing anything at all? And not only what are we trying to do, but how are we trying to do it? Another way of thinking about this that also comes from these two sections of negative dialectics is that in trying to think the object, one of the ways that this is contradictory, in trying to conceptualize an object or grasp an object with a concept, we're both trying to free the object and trying to dominate it. Now that goes back to the dialectics of identity and how he sees this operating in the commodity form, namely the incommensurable and the commensurable, the qualitative and the quantitative, the abstract and the concrete, the particular and the general, or the particular and the universal. That the commodity form has this paradoxical character. On the one hand, it did represent a kind of freeing of human activity from its traditional form, from really its traditional forms, its caste differentiated forms, trying to emancipate that activity to allow production to be an end in itself, to free the means from the traditional ends. But in capitalism, it is not only that, this value in the form of a commodity of labor power, of human activity in society, that also comes to dominate it. So if we take that as the basis of our conceptualization, that we're conceptualizing things and therefore philosophizing things, we're thinking things in the context of capitalism, not in some other context, like a religious context, historically, but in the modern society of capitalism, then thinking has to have this contradictory character that it might not have had before capitalism. So in a religious cosmology, in a traditional civilization, thinking about something, thinking something, trying to grasp it in the mind, was understood in religious terms. It was understood as trying to hear the voice of God, or hear the voice of the gods, to hear how God or the gods speak through creation, what things express, how we should relate to them, therefore, in a religious cosmology. God's purpose is revealed in things, and our purpose in God's creation is revealed in our thinking about things. Right? So that would be the social relations of a religious cosmology, which would affect what thinking is, what it's trying to do, what it's striving to achieve. In bourgeois society, in bourgeois social relations, thinking is trying to unite the incommensurable and the commensurable. Thinking, from Adorno's perspective, is a function of the commodity, a function of the commodity form. We think about commodities as commodities. We ourselves are commodities that think about other commodities. I think that when we read, I hope that I pointed this out, the very beginning of Marx's Das Kapital, the very beginning of chapter 1 of volume 1, the commodity. Right, so he says, in a society in which the capitalist mode of production predominates, we find wealth to be consisting of all sorts of commodities. Other language that he used, and that's used more broadly in Marxism, the commodity-producing society. Commodity-producing society. That means a society that produces commodities using other commodities. So labor is a commodity that produces other commodities. The Industrial Revolution introduces another commodity that produces other commodities, namely the machine. So in a commodity-producing society, it's a society for the production and reproduction of commodities. And that includes the reproduction of labor, the reproduction of labor power as a commodity that can continue to produce other commodities. Right, this is what it means to say that we live in the social relations of the commodity. We are commodities in our social relations, as well as treating others and nature and ourselves, ultimately, as commodities. That's the basis for Adorno of our thinking, of our consciousness, of our practice and our theory. We're going to see on Thursday a distinction should be made. So between thinking and theory, certainly between thinking and consciousness, since in the way this term consciousness is used, consciousness includes practice. It's not only theoretical consciousness, but it's practical consciousness. Consciousness and the subject is not only a theoretical or a thinking subject, but is a practical subject and an acting subject. So we will see that subject and object, theory and practice, thinking and acting. Thinking and acting. Right. There is a significance to the fact that he is saying thinking rather than theory, that he's saying thinking rather than consciousness. Part of this is in the sections of negative dialectics that we're not reading in the course, and that's the discussion of Heidegger. He does make mention of it elsewhere. So Heidegger certainly uses the term thinking, rather than concepts and rather than consciousness. Meaning he tries to radicalize philosophy by restricting it to a function of thinking. And what our thinking indicates about how we act and our practical relations with things, including not only other human beings, but objects of nature and ourselves. So that is part of the motivation of using the term thinking, is that this is kind of Heideggerian language. And he is trying to address philosophy in its afterlife, philosophy in its resuscitated state in the 20th century, in its radical character, meaning starting with thinking as the most basic category. Right, but otherwise we might not want to start with thinking as our most basic category. We might want to start at a higher level of mediation, a higher level of abstraction, namely consciousness, concepts, the subject, etc. But there might be a point in more radically starting with a vaguer and more indeterminate phenomenon, namely thinking. So I mentioned Heidegger uses the term thinking. Hegel does too. So again, from that first week's reading from the first day of class, Robert Pippin, one's own time comprehended in thought, or one's own time comprehended in thinking. Right, so there is some precedent for this. Okay, so I think those are the only notes that we have. So let me go back to our sections. Yeah. All right, so for the reading for tonight, let's work backwards from where we were supposed to end last night so we can cover what we did not. All right, so we just did 146 to 148, 151 to 153. Let's look at that. Okay, the objectivity of contradiction. So just very quickly, rather than go through in close detail, the objectivity of contradiction. Namely, contradiction is not a subjective phenomenon. Contradiction is not merely on the side of the subject or in what the subject is doing, but the contradiction is in reality itself. It's not just in our ideas or our concepts or in our use of them, but contradiction is actually in reality itself. In that sense, contradiction is objective. Now again, it's in reality, in our reality, in reality as it presents itself to us. It's in the objective reality that presents itself as such to us as subjects. All right, so it's not, contradiction might not be in the things in themselves or in the world in itself, but might only be in our concepts of things or in our subjectivity, but nonetheless our concepts of things and our subjectivity are themselves objective. So he says, such contradiction is not due to faulty subjective thinking. The embittering part of dialectics, notably for the reflexive philosophy that prevails now, as in Hegel's day, is in its objective contradictoriness. This, we say, is incomparable with flatly valid logic and removable by a formally unanimous judgment. Okay, so what is he talking about there? With the law of non-contradiction, so Aristotle. So Aristotle's logic, or we could say the very beginning of philosophy, logic as a philosophical phenomenon, the law of non-contradiction, meaning that a contradiction indicates a faulty logic, a logical fallacy, a subjective fault, a false way of thinking, a false subjectivity. So he's saying, at one level, of course, there's the law of non-contradiction. That would just be a fallacy. If there's a contradiction, then it's a fallacy. If it's a contradiction, it's a fault of subjective thinking. He doesn't accept that. It's not that contradiction is just in the way we think about things. No, the contradiction is in what we're thinking about itself. That's its objectivity. It says, as long as criticism sticks abstractly to the rules of logic, objective contradiction would be merely a pretentious way to put the fact that our subjective conceptual mechanism will inevitably claim truth for its judgment about the specific entity it judges, whereas this entity does coincide with the judgment only insofar as it is preformed in the definition of the concepts by the apophantic need. This would be easy to incorporate in the advanced logic of reflexive philosophy. I wonder if this is apophatic. No, it's apophantic. Let me see if that's a typo or not. No, apophantic is a correct word. Okay. Something that reveals itself something that is not hidden but is apparent. All right, so apophantic, declaratory. Something that is demonstrable and therefore knowable. There is the apophatic. Okay, apophatic is negation. So apophantic is what is revealed. Apophatic is what is negated. I knew that. I just want to make sure that they... Because at first I thought, he might mean apophatic. This would be easy to incorporate into the advanced logic of reflective philosophy, yet objective contradictoriness does not designate only whatever entity remains outside our judgments. It also designates something in what we judge. For what we mean in the judgment is always the entity due to be judged beyond the particular that is included in the judgment. Otherwise, according to its own intention, the judgment would be superfluous. And this intention is precisely what it does not satisfy. The negative motive of identitarian philosophy has remained in force. Nothing particular is true, no particular is itself as its particularity requires. Dialectical contradiction is neither the mere projection on the thing of a concept formation that miscarried, nor metaphysics running amok. Experience forbids the resolution in the unity of consciousness of whatever appears contradictory. For instance, a contradiction like the one between the definition, which an individual knows as his own, and his role, the definition forced upon him by society when he would be making his living. Such a contradiction cannot be brought under any unity without manipulation, without the insertion of some wretched cover concepts that will make the crucial differences vanish. Right, so it's a little bit opaque. So between the self-definition that an individual has and knows versus the role that the individual is playing. He says, nor is it possible to unify the contradiction that the exchange principle, remember I pointed out when it says barter, he means exchange, it's just a bad translation of that word, which in present society enhances the productive forces. So the exchange principle enhances the industrial forces of production, is simultaneously a growing threat to the existence of those forces. A subjective consciousness to which the contradiction is unbearable faces a desperate choice. Either such an individual must harmonistically stylize the contrary course of the world and heteronomously obey it against his own better insight, or, doggedly loyal to his own definition, He must act as if the world's course did not exist and must perish by it. On his own, by conceptual dispositions, he cannot eliminate the objective contradiction and its emanations. He can comprehend it. Everything else is an idle protestation. And he says, the contradiction weighs more heavily now than it did on Hegel, the first man to envision it. Once a vehicle of total identification, it has become the organon of its impossibility. The task of dialectical cognition is not, as its adversaries like to charge, to construe contradictions from above and to progress by resolving them, although Hegel's logic now and then proceeds in this fashion. Instead, it is up to dialectical cognition to pursue the inadequacy of thought and thing, to experience it in the thing. Dialectics need not fear the charge of being obsessed with the fixed idea of objective conflict in a thing already pacified. No single thing is at peace in the unpacified whole. The aporetical concepts, so the aporia of the concepts of philosophy, are marks of what is objectively, not just cogitatively, unresolved. To lay contradictions to incorrigible speculative obstinacy would be to shift the blame. A sense of shame bids philosophy not to repress Georg Simmel's insight that its history shows amazingly few indications of the sufferings of humankind. The history of philosophy. Dialectical contradiction is not simply. It means it has the subjective significance that it cannot be talked out of this. In this meaning, this intention, dialectics aims at what is different. It is, as philosophy's self-criticism, that the dialectical motion stays philosophical. All right, so again, if we pay attention to the fact that spirit here is on the side of the different, the new and the different. But the different that emerges, not the difference that pre-exists, the difference that is a potential and a possibility, a new potential and possibility. Skip some of these sections. Okay, objectivity and reification. This is actually an important section. Preponderance of the object is a thought of which any pretentious philosophy will be suspicious, since Fichte, aversion to it has been institutionalized. Protestations to the contrary, reiterated and varied 1,000-fold, seek to drown out the festering suspicion that heteronomy may be mightier than the autonomy, of which Kant already taught that it cannot be conquered by that superior power. Such philosophical subjectivism is the ideological accompaniment of the emancipation of the bourgeois I, or the bourgeois ego. It furnishes reasons for that emancipation. Its tenacious vigor is drawn from a misdirected opposition to the status quo, from opposition to its thingness. In relativizing or liquefying that thingness, philosophy believes to be above the supremacy of goods, and above the form of subjective reflection on that supremacy, a reified consciousness. So goods would mean commodities. In Fichte is a thinker after Kant, who Hegel then critiques, and it's part of the story of how philosophy developed in the 25 years of philosophy between Kant and Hegel. If Kant is about subject and object, then Fichte was about subject and subject. It was much more about the intersubjective. And then Hegel comes back to subject and object. In Fichte, that impulse to be above the supremacy of the commodity is as unmistakable as the urge to universal rule. It was an anti-ideological impulse only insofar as the world's being in itself, confirmed by a conventional unreflected consciousness, was seen through as merely manufactured and unfit for self-preservation. Despite the preponderance of the object, the thingness of the world is also phenomenal. It tempts the subjects to ascribe their own social circumstances of production to the noumena. This is elaborated in Marx's chapter on fetishes, the fetish character of the commodity that we read, truly a piece from the heritages of classic German philosophy. Even its systematic motive survives in that chapter. The fetish character of commodities is not laid to a subjectively errant consciousness, but objectively deduced from the social a priori, the exchange process. Marx already expresses the difference between the object's preponderance as a product of criticism and its extant caricature, its distortion by the commodity character. So he says barter, he means exchange. The translator. Here the translator translates it as merchandise character, it's the commodity character. Exchange as a process has real objectivity and is objectively untrue at the same time, transgressing against its own principle, the principle of equality. This is why of necessity it will create a false consciousness, the idols of the market. It is only in a sardonic sense that the exchange society's natural growth is a law of nature, that the predominance of economics is no invariant. The thinker may easily comfort himself by imagining that in the dissolution of reification of the commodity character, he possesses the philosopher's stone. But reification is itself the reflexive form of the false objectivity. Centering theory around reification, a form of consciousness, makes the critical theory idealistically acceptable to the reigning consciousness and to the collective unconsciousness. This is what raised Marx's early writings, in contradistinction to Das Kapital, to their present popularity, notably with theologians. So what he has in mind here is the economic and philosophic manuscripts. There is a good deal of irony in the fact that the brutal and primitive functionaries who more than 40 years ago damned Lukács as a heretic because of the reification chapter in his important History and Class Consciousness, did sense the idealistic nature of his conception. We can no more reduce dialectics to reification than we can reduce it to any other isolated category, however polemical. The cause of human suffering, meanwhile, will be glossed over rather than denounced in the lament about reification. The trouble is with the conditions that condemn mankind to impotence and apathy and would yet be changeable by human action. It is not primarily with people and with the way conditions appear to people. Considering the possibility of total disaster, reification is an epiphenomenon, and even more so is the alienation coupled with reification, the subjective state of consciousness that corresponds to it. Alienation is reproduced by anxiety. Consciousness, reified in the already constituted society, is not the constituents of anxiety. It's not what anxiety is made of. If a man looks upon thingness as radical evil, if he would like to dynamize all entity into pure actuality, he tends to be hostile to otherness, to the alien thing that has lent its name to alienation, and not in vain. He tends to that non-identity which would be the deliverance, not of consciousness alone, but of reconciled mankind, or reconciled humanity. Absolute dynamics, on the other hand, would be that absolute action whose violent satisfaction lies in itself, the action in which non-identity is abused as a mere occasion. So this should remind us of the reflections on class theory, where Adorno critiques the dialectic itself and talks about its dynamic and static sides. It's saying the dynamic side tends to be emphasized in bourgeois society and in appreciation for Marxism, whereas the static side is neglected, and he wants to bring that neglected side out more, to sort of emphasize that more. Unbroken and all too human slogans lend themselves to new equations between the subject and what is not its like. Things congeal as fragments of that which was subjugated. To rescue it means to love things. We cannot eliminate from the dialectics of the extant what is experienced in consciousness as an alien thing. Negatively, coercion and heteronomy, but also the marred figure of what we should love, and what the spell, the endogamy of consciousness, does not permit us to love. So endogamy and exogeny, these are anthropological terms that refer to marriage. So exogenous marriage means marrying outside of the group, and endogamous marriage means marrying within the group. Right, so he's saying consciousness under capitalism, consciousness under the spell, right, only allows consciousness to deal with itself and with its like, and not with what is different. The reconciled condition, which would not be the philosophical imperialism of annexing the alien. Instead, its happiness would lie in the fact that the alien, in the proximity it is granted, remains what is distant and different, beyond the heterogeneous and beyond that which is one's own. The tireless charge of reification resists that dialectics, and this indicts the conscious constructions used in the philosophy of history to back up that charge. The meaningful times for whose return the early Lukács yearned were as much due to reification to inhuman institutions as he would later attest it only in the bourgeois age. Contemporary representations of medieval towns usually look as if an execution were just taking place to cheer the populace. If any harmony of subject and object should have prevailed in those days, it was a harmony like the most recent one, pressure-born and brittle. The transfiguration of past conditions serves the purpose of a late superfluous denial that is experienced as a no-exit situation. Only as lost conditions do they become glamorous. Their cult, the cult of pre-subjective phases, arose in horror. In the age of individual disintegration and collective regression. With the delivery of the natural sciences, reification and reified consciousness also brought about the possibility of worldwide freedom from want. Even earlier, humanity was conditioned by dehumanized things. At least it went hand in hand with reified forms of consciousness, while indifference to things, appraising them as mere means and reducing them to the subject, helped to tear down humanity. In the realm of things, there is an intermingling of both the object's unidentical side and the submission of men to prevailing conditions of production, to their own functional contexts which they cannot know. The mature Marx, in his few remarks on the character of a liberated society, changed his position on the cause of reification, the division of labor. He now distinguished the state of freedom from original immediacy. In the moment of planning, the result of which he hoped would be production for use by the living rather than for profit, and thus, in a sense, a restitution of immediacy. In that planning, he preserved the alien thing. In his design for a realization of what philosophy had only thought, at first he preserved its mediation. But that there could be no dialectics without the element of solid things, that without such things it would level off into a harmless doctrine of change. This was attributable neither to philosophical habit nor solely to the social compulsion of which consciousness receives such solid knowledge. It is up to philosophy to think the things which differ from the thought, and yet make it a thought, exclusively, while their demon seeks to persuade the thought that it ought not to be. All right, so the demon he's talking about here is the Socrates demon, the demon that forbids the action of the person, of the subject. Let's see how we're doing for time here. Oops. Okay, we might be due a break soon. Let's take 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and get into the selections that we had for tonight. Let's take a short break. Okay, let's resume. Okay, the next section is Dialectics, Not a Sociology of Knowledge. He writes, "It was Marx who drew the line between historic materialism and the popular metaphysical kind. He thus involved the former in the problematics of philosophy, leaving popular materialism to cut its dogmatic capers on the other side of philosophy, like this side of philosophy meaning prior to any philosophy. Since then, materialism is no longer a counterposition one may resolve to take. It is the critique of idealism in its entirety, and of the reality for which idealism opts by distorting it. Horkheimer's phrasing, critical theory, seeks not to make materialism acceptable, but to use it to make men theoretically conscious of what it is that distinguishes materialism, distinguishes it from amateurish explications of the world as much as from the traditional theory of science. A dialectical theory is bound, like Marx's, largely, to be immanent, even if in the end it negates the whole sphere it moves in. This contrasts it with the sociology of knowledge that has been merely brought up from outside and is powerless against philosophy, as philosophy was quick to discover. A sociology of knowledge fails before philosophy. For the truth content of philosophy, it substitutes its social function and its conditioning by interests, while refraining from a critique of that content itself, remaining indifferent towards it. It fails equally before the concept of ideology, which it will stir into its broad, beggarly broth, for the concept of ideology makes sense only in relation to the truth or untruth of what it refers to. There can be no talk of socially necessary delusions except in regard to what would not be a delusion, although, of course, delusion is its index. The task of criticizing ideology, or critiquing ideology, the task of ideology critique, is to judge the subjective and objective shares and their dynamics. I wonder what shares. Let's see if we can look for. The Redmond translation might be better. Oops. lost it. Oh, the share of the subject and object and its dynamic. Right, so the word share is correct. But share in terms of what is in common rather than share in terms of dividing up. Okay. It is to deny the false objectivity of concept fetishism by reducing it to the social subject, and to deny false subjectivity, the sometimes unrecognizably veiled claim that all being lies in the mind, by showing it up as a fraud, a parasitical non-entity, as well as demonstrating its imminent hostility to the mind. The all of the indiscriminately total concept of ideology, however, terminates in nothingness. Once it has ceased to differ from any true consciousness, it is no longer fit to criticize a false one. In the idea of objective truth, materialist dialectics necessarily turns philosophical, despite and because of all of its criticisms of philosophy. A sociology of knowledge, on the other hand, denies not only the objective structure of society, but the idea of objective truth and its cognition. To this sociology, as to the type of positivist economics to which its founder Pareto belonged, society is nothing but the average value of individual reactive modes. The doctrine of ideology turns back into a doctrine of subjective idols, similar to the early bourgeois one. In fact, this is a shyster's trick to get rid of materialist dialectics as a whole, along with philosophy. Classification serves the Talkel localization of the mind. Such a reduction of so-called forms of consciousness goes perfectly with philosophical apologetics. The excuse of the sociology of knowledge that the truth or untruth of philosophical teaching has nothing to do with social conditions remains undisturbed. Relativism allies itself with the division of labor. The late Shaler did not hesitate to exploit this in his two worlds theory. The only way to pass philosophically into social categories is to decipher the truth content of philosophical categories. Let's see what that refers to. All right, so okay, so that would be a subjective and objective world, the two worlds theory. Last section from this first part of Negative Dialectics is materialism imageless. To those who do not want such realization, materialism has since done the favor to debase itself. The tutelage that caused this is not mankind's own fault, as Kant thought. In the meantime, at least, it has come to be systematically reproduced by men in power. The objective spirit, which they maneuver because they need its restraint, adjusts to a consciousness that has been restrained over thousands of years. A materialism come to political power is no less sold on such practices than the world it once wanted to change. It keeps fettering the human consciousness instead of comprehending it and changing it on its part. What he means here is, of course, the kind of Marxism that became an official ideology in the Soviet Union and the rest of the East Bloc communist world. On the threadbare pretext of a dictatorship, now a half a century old, of the proletariat, long bureaucratically administered, governmental terror machines entrench themselves as permanent institutions, mocking the theory that they carry on their lips. They chain their vassals to their most direct concerns and keep them stupid. Yet the deprivation of theory could not have happened had there been no apocryphal dregs in it. In their summary treatment of culture from the outside, the functionaries who monopolize it would clumsily feign superiority to culture, thereby rendering aid to universal regression. Those whose expectations of imminent revolution made them wish to liquidate philosophy were impatient enough with its demands to lag behind philosophy even then. The apocryphal part of materialism reveals the one of high philosophy, the untruth in the sovereignty of the spirit, which the reigning materialism disdains as cynically as bourgeois society used to do in secret. Idealistic majesty is the apocryphal imprint, a relationship which the texts of Kafka and Beckett glaringly illuminate. The deficiencies of materialism are the unreflected deficiencies of the prevailing condition. What has been unable to keep up due to the failing principle of spiritualization, or the Geistig, is worse in comparison with that which is superior and shamed by the sight of the lastingly inferior. This extraterritoriality of the Fourth Estate is perpetuated by materialism's Philistine and barbarian aspects, perpetuated into a culture which is now no longer confined to the Fourth Estate, but has spread throughout culture itself. Materialism comes to the very relapse into barbarism, which it was supposed to prevent. By Fourth Estate here, I think he means the proletariat. To work against this is not the most irrelevant among the tasks of critical theory. Otherwise, the old untruth will continue with a diminished coefficient of friction and a more baneful effect. Subalternity increases once the revolution has suffered the same fate as the Second Coming. Materialist theory became not only aesthetically defective as against the vacuous sublimity of bourgeois consciousness, it became untrue. This is theoretically determinable. Dialectics lies in things, but it could not exist without the consciousness that reflects in it, no more than it can evaporate into that consciousness. If matter were total, undifferentiated, and flatly singular, there would be no dialectics in it. In official materialist dialectics, epistemology was skipped by fiat. Epistemology's revenge has been the image doctrine. The thought is not an image of the thing. It becomes that only in an Epicurean-style materialist mythology, which invents the emission by matter of little images. The thought aims at the thing itself. Demythologization, the thought's enlightening intent, deletes the image character of consciousness. What clings to the image remains idolatry, mythic enthrallment. The totality of images blends into a wall before reality. The image theory denies the spontaneity of the subject, a movens of the objective dialectics of productive forces and conditions. If the subject is bound to mulishly mirror the object, necessarily missing the object, which only opens itself to the subjective surplus in the thought, the result is the unpeaceful spiritual silence of integral administration. Nothing but an indefatigably reified consciousness will believe, or will persuade others to believe, that it possesses photographs of objectivity. The illusions of such consciousness turn into dogmatic immediacies. When Lenin, rather than go in for epistemology, opposed it in compulsively reiterated avowals of the noumenality of cognitive objects, he meant to demonstrate that subjective positivism is conspiring with the powers that be. His political requirements turned him against the goal of theoretical cognition. A transcendent argumentation disposes of things on the basis of its claims to power, and with disastrous results. The unpenetrated target of the criticism remains undisturbed as it is, and not being hit at all, it can be resurrected at will in changed constellations of power. Brecht said once that the book on imperiocriticism, this is Lenin's book, obviated any further need to criticize philosophy of immanence. It was a short-sighted remark. Materialist theory is subject to philosophical desiderata if it is not to succumb to the same provincialism that disfigures art in the Eastern countries. The object of theory is not something immediate, of which theory might carry home a replica. Knowledge has not, like the state police, a rogues gallery of its objects. Rather, it conceives them as it conveys them. Else it would be content to describe the facade. As Brecht did admit, after all, the criterion of sense perception, overstretched and problematic even in its proper place, is not applicable to radically indirect society. What immigrated into the object as the law of its motion, inevitably concealed by the ideological form of the phenomenon, eludes that criterion. Marx, disgusted with the academic squabbles, went rampaging through the epistemological categories like the proverbial bull in the china shop. He scarcely put too much weight on terms such as reflection, where alleged supremacy is won at the cost of subjective critical intent, or a subjective critical moment. Living side by side with ideology in the stress on that moment is a bit of hostility to knowledge. A bit of hostility to ideology, a bar to the subreption that products and conditions of production are immediate nature. No theory may, for agitational simplicity's sake, play the fool about objectively attained knowledge. Theory must reflect the state of this knowledge and promote its advance. The unity of theory and practice was not meant to be a concession to weakness of thought, which is a terrorism spawned by the repressive society. I wonder if that's a typo. Oh, an abnormal or malformed structure. Okay, so that's an accurate translation. The computer, which thinking wants to make its own equal, and to whose greater glory it would like nothing better than to eliminate itself, is the bankruptcy petition of consciousness in the face of a reality which at the present stage is not given visually but functionally, an abstraction in itself. So keep this in mind when thinking about AI or machine learning. Representational thinking would be without reflection, an undialectical contradiction, for without reflection there is no theory. A consciousness interpolating images, a third element, between itself and that which it thinks, would unwittingly reproduce idealism. A body of ideas would substitute for the object of cognition, and the subjective arbitrariness of such ideas is that of the authorities. The materialist longing to grasp the thing aims at the opposite. It is only in the absence of images that the full object could be conceived. Such absence concurs with the theological ban on images. Materialism brought that ban into secular form by not permitting utopia to be positively pictured. This is the substance of its negativity. At its most materialistic, materialism comes to agree with theology. Its great desire would be the resurrection of the flesh, a desire utterly foreign to idealism, the realm of the absolute spirit. The prospective vanishing point of historic materialism would be its self-sublimation, the spirit's liberation from the primacy of material needs in their state of fulfillment. Only if the physical urge were quenched would the spirit be reconciled and would become that which it only promises, while the spell of material conditions will not let it satisfy material needs. All right, so we had there a little reiteration of what Benjamin was talking about in the theological political fragment that we read last time. Now we're getting into the readings that we had assigned for tonight as opposed to last night. Freedom and organized society. Without any thought of freedom, theoretical reasons for an organized society would be hard to find. Society, in its turn, will then curtail freedom. Both might be shown on Hobbes's construction of the social contract. Unlike Hobbes, the determinist, a factually consistent determinism would sanction the bellum omnium contra omnes, so the war of all against all. If all men were equally predetermined and blind, every criterion of actions would fall by the wayside. The perspective of an extremity is unveiled, whether the demand for freedom put forth so that men can live together does not contain a paralogism, that freedom must be a reality lest there be horror. In fact, there is horror, because there is no freedom yet. Reflection on the question of free will does not abolish the question, but turns it into one of the philosophy of history. Why have the two theses, the will is free and the will is unfree, become an antinomy? The historical origin of that reflection did not escape Kant, who expressly based the revolutionary claim of his own ethics on the delay in the reflection. Man was seen to be bound to laws by his duty, but it occurred to no one that the only legislation to which man is subject is his own, and yet universal, and that his only obligation is to act in line with a will that is his own, but is also universally law-giving according to the ends of nature. By no means, however, did it occur to Kant whether freedom itself, to him an eternal idea, might not be essentially historic, and that not just as a concept, but in its empirical substance. Whole epochs, whole societies, lacked not only the concept of freedom, but the thing. To attribute the thing to them as an objective noumenon, even though totally hidden from the people concerned, would conflict with the Kantian transcendental principle, with the principle that is said to be founded in the subjective consciousness, and would be untenable as the supposed consciousness at large if it were wholly lacking in any living person. Hence, probably, Kant's stubborn endeavor to demonstrate the moral sense as something that exists everywhere, even in the radically wicked. Otherwise, he would have had to say that phases in societies in which there is no freedom are not only not rational, but not human. And the adherent of Rousseau would scarcely have stooped to saying that. Before the formation of the individual in the modern sense, which to Kant was a matter of course, in the sense meaning not simply the biological human being, but the one constituted as a unit by its own self-reflection, the Hegelian self-consciousness. It is an anachronism to talk of freedom, whether as a reality or as a challenge. Likewise, freedom, which without impairment can only be achieved under social conditions of unfettered plenty, might be wholly extinguished again, perhaps without leaving a trace. The trouble is not that free men do radical evil, as evil is being done beyond all measure conceivable to Kant. The trouble is that as yet there is no world in which, there are flashes of this in Brecht's work, men would no longer need to be evil. Evil, therefore, is the world's own unfreedom. Whatever evil is done comes from the world. Society destines the individuals to be what they are, even by their imminent genesis. Their freedom or unfreedom is not primary, as it would seem under the spell of the principium individuationis. For the ego, as Schopenhauer explained by the myth of Maya's veil, makes even the insight into its dependence difficult to gain for the subjective consciousness. The principle of individualization, the law of particularity to which the universal reason of the individual is tied, tends to insulate them from the encompassing contexts, and thereby strengthens their flattering confidence in the subject's autarky. Under the name of freedom, their totality is contrasted with the totality of whatever restricts individuality. Yet the principium individuationis, this is the principle of individuation, is by no means the metaphysically ultimate and unalterable, and thus it is not freedom either. Freedom is a moment, rather in a twofold sense. It is entwined, not to be isolated, and for the time being, it is never more than an instant of spontaneity, a historical node, the road to which is blocked under present conditions. The individual's independence, inappropriately stressed by liberal ideology, does not prevail, nor is there any denying his extremely real separation from society, which that ideology misinterprets. At times, the individual would oppose himself to society as an independent being, though a particular one, a being capable of rationally pursuing its own interest. In that phase, and beyond it, the question of freedom was the genuine question, whether society permits the individual to be as free as it promises. And thus it was also the question whether society itself is as free as it promises. Temporarily, the individual looms above the blind social context, but in his windowless isolation, he only helps so much more to reproduce that context. No less indicative of the historic experience that inside and outside are unreconciled is the thesis of unfreedom. Men are unfree because they are beholden to externality, and this externality in turn consists also of men themselves. As perceived in Hegel's phenomenology, it is only from that which has been divided from it, from that which is necessarily against it, that the subject acquires the concepts of freedom and unfreedom, which it will then relate to its own monadological structure. So this language that he's using here is the windowless monad. It's Leibniz's theology as well as Leibniz's theory of physical reality. So it's an atomic theory of matter in which matter is made up of infinitesimal units, each of which is what he calls a windowless monad. So an atom is a windowless monad, but he also says in his theology that the soul is a windowless monad. What does that mean? Well, monad means something completely self-contained. Windowless means without any access to what's outside it. So what's the significance of this? So the idea is that though matter is made up of atoms, each of which is completely closed off within itself, and nonetheless relates to the other windowless monads. How? Through divinity, through divine creation itself. So the universe is made up of infinitesimal particles that are windowless monads, but nonetheless unified in the mind of God and therefore in divine creation itself. So it is with the soul. The soul is also a windowless monad, whose relation to other souls is through God. Okay, so this is late 1600s. Leibniz is a contemporary of Spinoza. He says, the pre-philosophical consciousness is located this side of the alternative. To a subject that acts naively and opposes itself to its environment, its own conditioning is non-transparent. Right, so it appears as a windowless monad. It actually isn't a windowless monad, but it appears to be one. And that's because its own conditions, its own conditioning, the production of the individual remains opaque to itself, or non-transparent to itself. To dominate this conditioning, consciousness must render it transparent. The thought, by means of its freedom, turns back to itself as to its object, and its sovereignty also leads to the concept of unfreedom. The two concepts are not a simple antithesis, they are interwoven. No theoretical curiosity can make us aware of this. It is the nature-controlling sovereignty in its social form, domination over people, that suggests the opposite to our consciousness, the idea of freedom. Its historical archetype was he who is topmost in the hierarchies, the man who is not visibly dependent. Right, so he's saying that only unfreedom makes us aware of the possibility of freedom. And conversely, it's only the possibility of freedom that makes us aware of unfreedom. In the abstract universal concept of things beyond nature, freedom is spiritualized into freedom from the realm of causality. With that, however, it becomes a self-deception. Psychologically speaking, the subject's interest in the thesis that it is free would be narcissistic, as immoderate as anything of the kind. There is narcissism even in Kant's arguments, for all his categorical localization of freedom in a sphere above psychology. According to his foundation for metaphysics of morals, everyone, including the most arrant knave, need only be shown examples of honest intent, of constancy in following good maxims, of compassion, and of general goodwill, to wish that he too were so minded. He can expect no gratification of desires from this, no condition that would satisfy any of his real or otherwise conceivable inclinations, but only a greater inner worth of his person. But he believes that he is this better person when he puts himself on the standpoint of a member of the intelligible world, a move he is involuntarily compelled to make by the idea of freedom, i.e., independence of determining causes from the sensible world. There is no effort Kant will not make to prove that this expectation of an enhanced interpersonal worth, this supposed motivation behind the thesis of freedom, rests in turn upon the moral law, on the very objectivity to which, on the other hand, consciousness is said to rise only on grounds of that expectation. And yet he cannot make us forget that in our view of freedom, the practical use of common human reason is coupled with that need for self-exaltation with the person's worth. That immediate consciousness, the common moral cognition of reason, which is the methodological starting point of Kant's foundation or groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, will find itself no less interested in denying the same freedom which it claims. The more freedom the subject, and the community of subjects, ascribes to itself, the greater its responsibility. And before this responsibility it must fail in a bourgeois life, which in practice has never yet endowed a subject with the unabridged autonomy accorded to it in theory. Hence the subject must feel guilty. There he's bringing in a little bit of Freudian psychoanalytic theory, namely that the ego is dominated by the superego. The ego is dominated by a sense of guilt. All right, he continues, what makes the subjects aware of the bounds of their freedom is that they are part of nature, and finally, that they are powerless against society, which has become independent of them. Yet the universality of the concept of freedom, a concept shared by the oppressed as well, recoils against dominion as freedom's model. Reacting to this recoil, those who have the privilege of freedom delight in finding others not yet ripe for freedom. They rationalize this persuasively by way of natural causality. The subjects are not only fused with their own physical nature, a consistent legality holds sway also in the psychological realm, or lawfulness also holds sway in the psychological realm, which reflection has laboriously divided from the world of bodies. This feeling rose proportionally with the soul's definition as a unit. But a sense of unfreedom exists no more than does an immediately evident sense of freedom, It always requires either that socially perceived phenomena be reflected upon the subject. The oldest instance is the so-called Platonic psychology of Plato, or that objectifications be performed by psychological science, in whose hands its discovery, the life of the soul, becomes a thing among other things, and falls under the causality predicated by the world of things. Alright, let me see if I can find the... Oh, here we go. All right, 244, 245. I'm going to jump ahead here. Okay. We're running short on time. Okay. An excursion to Hegel, and this is in the part 2 of the book World Spirit and Natural History. So this section is called Trend and Facts. Most sensitively resisted by human common sense, by the sound mind whose soundness is what ails it, is the preponderance of anything objective over the individuals, in their consciousness as well as in their coexistence. The preponderance can be experienced crassly day after day. One represses it as an unfounded speculation, so the individuals may continue to flatter themselves that their standardized notions are twice unconditional truths, so that their delusions may be preserved from the suspicion of not being so, and of their lives being doomed. Ours is an epoch that has been as relieved to shed the system of objective idealism, that's Hegel's philosophy, as to discard the economic doctrine of objective values. That would be Adam Smith and Marx's labor theory of value. And the theorems that are particularly topical in such an epoch are the ones said to be of no use to a spirit that seeks its own security and the security of cognition in the extant, in what exists, in social institutions as the well-organized sums of immediate individual facts, or in the subjective character of their members. The objective and ultimately absolute Hegelian spirit, the Marxist law of value that comes into force without men being conscious of it, to an unleashed experience these are more evident than the prepared facts of a positivistic social bustle which today extends to the native pre-scientific consciousness. Only to the greater glory of objective cognition, that activity breaks men of the habit of experiencing the real objectivity to which they are subjected, in themselves as well. If thinking people were capable of such experience and prepared for it, it would have to undermine their belief in facticity itself. It would have to make them go so far beyond the facts that the facts would lose their unreflected primacy over the universals, which triumphant nominalism holds for nothing, for a subtractable adjunct tacked on by the classifying scientist. That's again what we addressed earlier, the concepts as a label on the object. There is a line in the initial deliberation of Hegel's logic to the effect that nothing in the world is not as mediated as it is immediate. And nowhere does this line endure more precisely than in the facts of which historiography is so proud. So let's unpack that. This is also a phrase that Lukács used in the reading that we did from him last week, namely that what is apparently immediate is actually the most mediated. He says, of course, when the Gestapo knocks on a dissenter's door at 6 a.m., under Hitlerite fascism, it would be foolish to use epistemological refinements to deny that the individual to whom this happens is more directly affected than by the preceding power plays and by the installation of the party machine in every branch of administration, let alone by the historical trend that shattered the continuity of the Weimar Republic, and does not show in any context other than in a conceptual one, and not compulsorily except in the theoretical unfoldment. And yet in the brute fact of the governmental onslaught which fascism looses on the individual, does depend on all those moments, however remote and currently irrelevant they may be to the victim. All right, so whatever is immediately happening has a mediated character in the sense that it's the product of history. It would take the most wretched nitpicking, garbed as scientific acribia, to blind us to the facts that the French Revolution, for all the abrupt concurrence of some of its acts, fitted into the overall course of bourgeois emancipation. The revolution would have been neither possible nor successful if in 1789 the key positions of economic production had not been already occupied by the bourgeoisie, if it had not already topped the absolutist crest of a feudalism that coalesced at times with the bourgeois interest. Recall that this goes back to Adam Smith's narration of the history of the emergence of bourgeois society, the alliance of the bourgeoisie, namely the town dwellers, the people of the free towns of emerging bourgeois society, the alliance that they had with the absolute monarchs against the feudal aristocracy and the church. Nietzsche's scandalizing imperative, what's falling ought to be pushed, serves ex post facto to codify an arch-bourgeois maxim. Probably all bourgeois revolutions were decided in advance by the historic upsurge of the respective class. An admixture of ostentation was then externalized in art as classicist decor. Even so, at the point of historic fracture, that trait would have scarcely been realized without the acute absolutist mismanagement and the financial crisis on which the physiocratic reformers foundered under Louis XVI. The specific privations of the masses of Paris, at least, presumably set off the moment, while in other countries, where the need was not so acute, the bourgeois emancipation process succeeded without a revolution, and left the more or less absolutist form of government initially untouched. One advantage of the infantile distinction of deeper cause and outward occasion is that it crudely registers the dualism of immediacy and mediation. The occasions are immediate, the so-called deeper causes are what mediates, and what encompasses what incorporates the details. As late as the most recent past, the preponderance of the trend could be read in all the facts themselves, specifically military acts such as the bombing raids on German cities, functioned as slum clearing, retroactively integrated with that urban transformation which has long been observable around the globe, not in North America alone. Or, the strengthening of the family in the emergency situations of refugee life did temporarily slow down the tendency to anti-family developments. But it hardly stopped the trend. In Germany, too, the number of divorces and that of incomplete families kept increasing. Even the Spanish conquests of Old Mexico and Peru, which had been felt there like invasions from another planet, even those, irrationally for the Aztecs and Incas, rendered bloody assistance to the spread of bourgeois rational society, all the way to the conception of one world that is teleologically inherent in that society's principle. The trend can never do without the facts, but ultimately such preponderance of it within the facts makes the old-fashioned old-fashioned line between cause and occasion look silly. The whole distinction, not just the occasion, is external because the concrete cause lies in the occasion. If courtly mismanagement was a lever of the uprisings in parts, even that mismanagement remained a function of the total picture of the absolutist putting out economy's lag behind the capitalist income economy. I think that this is supposed to be the lever of the uprisings in Paris, I think. I don't think that that's a misprint or a typo. The putting out economy is the kind of pre-industrial commodity producing economy. It's what we talked about in terms of formal versus real subsumption. That's what he means by the capitalist income economy. Moments which, as in the French Revolution, run counter to the historical entirety, while doing only so much more to promote it. Such moments derive their potency from that historical entirety alone, or totality alone. Even the lagging productive forces of one class lag only relatively, not absolutely, behind the advanced forces of the other class. One has to know all that to construe a philosophy of history, and it is for this reason, as much as any other, visibly in the cases of Hegel and Marx already, the philosophy of history comes as close to historiography as historiography itself. The insight into the essence veiled by the facticity it qualifies has come to be impossible save as philosophy. All right. Okay. I think that we skipped over, or maybe we didn't. Oh, we did. Somehow we skipped over this section, which is important. It's in the introduction. It's in the very first section of the reading that we were supposed to do last night. Somehow we skipped over it. I want to look at just this section. This will be important for our readings on Thursday. The antagonistic totality. Such a concept of dialectics makes us doubt its possibility. However varied, the anticipation of moving in contradictions throughout seems to teach a mental totality, the very identity thesis we have just rendered inoperative. The mind which ceaselessly reflects on contradiction in the thing itself, we hear, must be the thing itself if it is to be organized in the form of contradiction. The truth which in idealistic dialectics drives beyond every particular, as one-sided and wrong, is the truth of the whole, and if that were not preconceived, the dialectical steps would lack motivation and direction. We have to answer that the object of a mental experience is an antagonistic system in itself, antagonistic in reality, not just in its conveyance to the knowing subject that rediscovers itself therein. The coercive state of reality, which idealism had projected into the region of the subject and the mind, must be retranslated from that region. What remains of idealism is that society, the objective determinant of the mind, is as much an epitome of subjects as it is their negation. In society, the subjects are unknowable and incapacitated, hence its desperate objectivity and conceptuality, which idealism mistakes for something positive. The system is not one of the absolute spirit. It is one of the most conditioned spirit of those who have it and cannot even know how much it is their own. The subjective preconception of the material production process in society, basically different from its theoretical constitution, is the unresolved part. the part unreconciled with the subjects. Their own reason, unconscious like the transcendental subject in establishing identity by exchange, remains incommensurable with the subjects it reduces to the same denominator, the subject as the subject's foe. The preceding generality is both true and untrue. True because it forms that ether, which Hegel calls spirit. Untrue because its reason is not reason yet, because its universality is the product of particular interests. This is why a philosophical critique of identity transcends philosophy. But the ineffable part of the utopia is what defies subsumption under identity. The use value, in Marxist terminology, is necessary anyway if life is to go on at all, even under the prevailing circumstances of production. The utopia extends to the sworn enemies of its realization.
Yeah. All right. So we're in the
regarding the concrete utopian possibility, dialectics is the ontology of the wrong state of things. The right state of things would be free of it, neither a system nor a contradiction. It's an important thesis statement of what Adorno is trying to do with negative dialectics, as well as with the preponderance of the object, or the primacy of the object. The right state of things would be free of it. So, regarding the concrete utopian possibility, dialectics is the ontology of the wrong state of things. So dialectics is the logic of being, that's what ontology means, of the wrong state of things. So the logic by which the wrong state of things has come into being. The right state of things would be free of it, neither a system nor a contradiction. So neither a system nor a contradiction. Right, so the right state of things would be beyond dialectics. That's really one of the basic ideas that Adorno has here in Negative Dialectics. That the goal is to overcome the necessity of dialectics. The goal is to overcome the truth of dialectics. The goal is to overcome dialectics itself. And that's a much more specific way in which philosophy is meant to be abolished by being realized. Or, conversely, philosophy is to be realized by being abolished. Right, so dialectics points beyond itself. Dialectics has become self-contradictory, and therefore dialectics points beyond itself. So that's what negative dialectics means. A negative dialectics is a critical dialectics, and that's what the preponderance or the primacy of the object is meant to indicate, the necessity for the dialectic to overcome itself. Okay. So that leaves for our final discussion a kind of shift in gear, namely subject and object and marginality to theory and praxis will have a lot in common with what we were just talking about, but it will bring some of this material that we've been dealing with in negative dialectics into a more social and political realm. It will bring it more into contact with what's going on in society and politics in the late 1960s. And that's where the other two readings that we have, Late Capitalism or Industrial Society and Resignation, will also bring us more fully into the concrete social and political reality at the end of Adorno's life, where We will see that Late Capitalism or Industrial Society from 1968. He published that in English translation under the title as Marx Obsolete. That's the topic of the essay, and his answer is no, Marx is not obsolete. However, Marx appears to be obsolete, so he has to deal with that apparent falsification of Marx and of Marxism and the apparent contradiction. The two theses. Marx is obsolete, Marx is not obsolete. And in light of what capitalism looks like in the late 1960s, which is different from the capitalism that Marx described in the 1800s. It's also, by the way, different from the capitalism we might have around us today in the 21st century. But we'll see what Adorno has to say about the late 20th century. All right, that will be when we return on Thursday. Okay, let's adjourn for now, and I will see you guys on Thursday.
Thank you.
All right, good night, guys.